In 1896, a black African king humiliated Europe so badly they tried to erase him from history. While the world was being carved up by white empires, one man said no and backed it up. Italy sent 20,000 soldiers armed with machine guns, artillery, and the arrogance of centuries. He sent them home in pieces. This is the story they don't want you to know. Picture this. It's 1884, and European leaders are sitting in a room in Berlin, drinking wine and smoking cigars. On the table in front of them is a map of Africa. They're drawing lines across it with rulers, dividing up an entire continent like it's a piece of property they just inherited. No African leaders were invited to this conference. No African consent was asked for. They just took it. Within 15 years, 90% of Africa would be colonized. Millions would be enslaved, murdered, or displaced. Entire civilizations would be erased. And here's what makes it even more insane. By the 1890s, only two African nations remained independent: Liberia and Ethiopia. Ethiopia, also known as Abyssinia, was no ordinary kingdom. This was a 3,000-year-old Christian empire in the Horn of Africa, with its own written language, its own ancient traditions, and its own fierce pride. In 1889, a man named Menelik II became emperor. He was intelligent, strategic, and he understood something crucial. The Europeans were coming for him next. Italy, desperate for colonial glory and watching jealously as Britain and France carved up the continent, had its eyes fixed on Ethiopia. They wanted their piece of Africa, and they were willing to lie, cheat, and kill to get it. So Italy did what colonizers do best. They cheated. In 1889, they convinced Menelik to sign the Treaty of Wuchale. But here's the twist. The treaty had two versions. The Italian version, written in Italian, stated that Ethiopia was now Italy's protectorate, essentially a colony. The Amharic version, the one Menelik signed, said nothing of the sort. When Menelik discovered the deception, he was furious. He immediately canceled the treaty. Italy's response wasn't negotiation. It wasn't diplomacy. It was war. Now, you have to understand the context here. This was the height of European arrogance. Italian newspapers were openly mocking primitive Africans. Military experts were predicting an easy victory in a matter of weeks. Europe had just watched Britain crush the Zulu kingdom, France dominate West Africa, and Belgium commit unspeakable atrocities in the Congo. The pattern seemed clear and inevitable. White armies always won. Black armies always lost. It was treated as a law of nature, proof of racial superiority. Italy believed that Africans couldn't organize, couldn't strategize, and couldn't possibly stand against European military might. In 1895, Italy invaded. 20,000 Italian troops, backed by Eritrean conscripts, crossed the Ethiopian border. They were equipped with modern rifles, mountain artillery, and machine guns. They were led by General Oreste Baratieri, a man so confident in victory that he was already planning his triumphal parade through Rome. But Menelik wasn't the king they expected. When news of the invasion reached him, he sent a message to every noble, every regional king, every ethnic group across Ethiopia. An enemy has come to destroy our country and our faith. And something unprecedented happened. Rival kingdoms that had been fighting each other for generations put down their weapons and united. Different ethnic groups, different religions, all rallied under one banner. Menelik mobilized over 100,000 soldiers. And here's the part they really don't want you to know. His secret weapon was a woman. Empress Taitu Betul wasn't just Menelik's wife. She was a military strategist, a diplomat, and a battlefield commander. While European historians were busy pretending African women were passive and decorative, Taitu was coordinating troop movements, organizing supply lines, and preparing for war. But there's another myth that needs to be shattered here. You've probably been taught that Africans were fighting with spears against European guns, right? That's the story they tell to make European victories seem inevitable and African resistance seem futile. The truth is completely different. Menelik had been preparing for this war for years. He'd been stockpiling modern weapons, buying rifles from France, Russia, and even Italy itself. Ethiopia had artillery. They had Maxim guns. They had trained officers. But Europe didn't believe black Africans were capable of using modern weapons effectively. That racist assumption would cost them everything. As Menelik moved his 100,000-strong army across the treacherous Ethiopian highlands, Empress Taitu coordinated the logistics of feeding and moving an army on the march. Italian spies reported the numbers back to Rome, but their commanders didn't believe them. Exaggerated by primitive minds, they said. Meanwhile, Taitu was personally leading scouts, cutting Italian supply lines, and using Ethiopia's mountainous terrain to her advantage. Ethiopian forces would appear, strike, and then vanish into the mountains like ghosts. The Italians grew paranoid, exhausted, and confused. Back in Rome, politicians were pressuring Baratieri, win quickly or come home in disgrace. So in March of 1896, Baratieri made a fatal decision. He would attack at dawn and catch the sleeping Africans by surprise. He ordered a night march, but there was one problem. His maps were wrong. They'd been drawn by Italians who had never actually traveled through the region, who assumed they knew better than the people who'd lived there for millennia. In the darkness, his columns got separated. Units lost contact with each other. Coordination fell apart. And when dawn broke on March 1st, the Italians realized they'd walked straight into a trap. As the sun rose over the mountains of Adwa, the Italian soldiers looked up and saw something that shattered every assumption they'd ever held. They weren't facing a disorganized mob of spear-wielding tribesmen. They were surrounded on three sides by a disciplined army in perfect battle formation, holding the high ground. Menelik's forces had modern weapons, clear command structure, and they knew every inch of this terrain. The Italians couldn't coordinate. They couldn't communicate between separated columns. And then the Ethiopian attack began. What happened next wasn't a battle. It was a slaughter. Ethiopian forces used modern military tactics, flanking maneuvers, combined arms coordination, devastating artillery support. Empress Taitu personally led cavalry charges, her presence on the battlefield, inspiring the troops and terrifying the enemy. And here's something that should tell you everything about how this war was really going. The Italian Ascari, African soldiers who'd been conscripted to fight for Italy, started defecting in the middle of the battle. They switched sides and joined Menelik's forces, recognizing who the real enemy was. By noon, the Italian army wasn't retreating. It was disintegrating. The numbers tell the story. 7,000 Italian soldiers killed, 1,500 wounded, 3,000 captured. Ethiopia lost between 4,000 and 6,000 soldiers, but from a much larger force. This was the worst defeat of a European army by Africans in the entire history of colonialism. And what makes it even more remarkable is what happened next. The prisoners were treated well, fed, and given medical care. This was in stark contrast to how Europeans treated African captives, who were routinely executed, enslaved, or left to die. Menelik negotiated their release and forced Italy to the bargaining table. In October 1896, Italy signed the Treaty of Addis Ababa, formally recognizing Ethiopian independence. This was the first time a European colonial power had signed an equal treaty with an African nation since the era of colonialism began. The news of Adwa sent shockwaves through every colonial capital in Europe. If Ethiopians could win, what about everyone else? What about the millions of colonized people across Africa, Asia, and the Americas? The Battle of Adwa threatened the entire ideological foundation of colonialism, the racist lie that European dominance was natural, inevitable, and biological. So Europe did what it always does when the narrative threatens to collapse. They launched a cover-up campaign. The Italian government suppressed the details of the battle. European historians downplayed it as a lucky accident or a fluke. Racist pseudoscience was deployed to explain it away. Ethiopians are Semitic, not really black, so it doesn't count. American textbooks barely mentioned it, and when they did, they implied that Italy wasn't really trying, or had simply let them win. The erasure was systematic and deliberate, but here's what they were really trying to bury. Menelik was a strategic genius who unified a fractured nation, modernized his military, and played European powers against each other. Taytu was a military commander in her own right, not just a decorative wife, but an active battlefield leader and intelligence coordinator. Ethiopia preserved its independence through World War I and World War II, despite a brief Italian occupation from 1936 to 1941. And most dangerously of all, Adwa inspired global resistance movements. Black Americans celebrated the victory. Marcus Garvey in Jamaica cited it as proof of black capability and power. Anti-colonial movements everywhere drew hope from it. A black king had outwitted, outmaneuvered, and outfought white supremacy using their own weapons and their own tactics on their own terms. One battle had shattered centuries of propaganda, and that was unforgivable. Here's the pattern you need to understand. When black people win, history gets rewritten. Victories become flukes. Leaders become warlords. Civilizations become tribes. This isn't accidental. It's essential to white supremacy's survival. Because if people knew the truth, if they knew that resistance was always possible, that African kingdoms defeated European armies, that black brilliance has always existed, the entire structure of racial hierarchy would collapse. And here's the final twist that reveals everything. Italy invaded Ethiopia again in 1935 under Mussolini. They used chemical weapons. They bombed civilians. They finally occupied the country from 1936 to 1941. Why would they come back with such overwhelming illegal force nearly 40 years later? Because they never forgave Adwa. Because one black king had exposed them as beatable, had humiliated them in front of the entire world. And that was more dangerous than any army. The fact that they had to return with poison gas and total war tactics tells you everything about how badly Menelik had defeated them the first time. So here's what you need to remember. They don't erase weak enemies from history. They erase the ones who won. Every time someone tells you that Africans never resisted colonialism, remember Adwa. Every time someone claims that black people built nothing and achieved nothing, remember a 3,000-year-old kingdom that stood when all others fell. Every time someone suggests that European military dominance was inevitable, remember March 1, 1896, when a black king and queen commanded 100,000 soldiers to victory against a modern European army. Emperor Menelik II didn't just defeat an army that day, he defeated a lie, the foundational lie of white supremacy, the claim that black people were incapable of self-governance, military brilliance, and civilizational achievement. And they've been trying to bury that truth ever since. The Battle of Adwa proved that resistance is possible. Remembering it proves that erasure is never complete. This is the story they don't want you to know. Now you know it. Don't let them forget again.